All right, I think that's going. Cool, fantastic. Okay, well, welcome along to the third episode of Minds of Giants, where I talk to people who are generally interesting. I'm wondering about the name because it seems like everybody I talk to should be like an industry leading like professional, But so far everyone's just been doing cool stuff or been people that I've been able to like drag off the streets to actually come talk to me.
Yeah, it sounds like an indie band from the 80s, doesn't it?
It really does.
Minds of Giants.
So with me today I have Professor Richard Shaw, who is, I'll go through your many accolades.
Thank you, Luke.
Who is the Director of Massey's BA, Bachelor of Arts, to External Connections, promoting the benefits and merits of BAs to outside audiences, Professor of Politics, teaching various political papers, responsible for the creation and teaching of Turanga Waiwai, Identity and Belonging in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is probably, to everyone I've spoken to, the major paper in their BA, or the one that's had the most impact.
Ooh, good to hear.
Co-authored the book for that, and various other ones. Yeah. And has also penned various articles about politics or the Bachelor of Arts in general in Stuff, the New Zealand Herald, and several other places. And you're also a political scientist, I believe is the correct term, focusing on what have we got here? Cabinet government systems, and specifically the roles of political advisors in government ministers' offices.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good due diligence, man.
Thank you. It took about 10 minutes of Googling. I've got a couple main talking points that I want to hit on. One, obviously, politics, and the second one, BAs and generally the attitudes around universities. But first, why did you do politics?
Well, first, I didn't do politics first. My first degree was in social work. I came here from Taranaki in the early 1980s to do a 4-year degree in social work, and I have no idea why I did that. Occasionally I've gone back and I've scoured my memory thinking, why did I do that degree rather than anything else like politics? And I really can't remember why, except there was a hell of a lot of political content in that degree. And then I went away and did a bunch of things, worked in sheep farms and as a rousey and in security work and one thing or another. And I worked as a social worker in the East End of London and in some NHS hospitals, and I was really shit at it. And I didn't enjoy it and didn't really understand it, and came back here and just wandered out to the university to say g'day to a couple of people who'd been really, really good teaching academics. Steve Mahari was one of those. Mike O'Brien, who's up in Auckland, was another. And I bumped into a guy called Raj Prasad, who went on to become a Labour Party list MP and a race relations conciliator, and he held out a job application form to me and said, we got a job, do you want to apply?
Fantastic.
So I did.
Yeah.
And I got the job, and it involved teaching, designing and teaching papers on New Zealand politics. So I didn't have any formal background.
Oh, okay.
I landed in that position, and as soon as I realised what it was that he'd asked me to do, I thought, yep, this is what I should have been doing all along. So serendipity, man, just
fantastic.
Straight out serendipity, yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, that's really interesting. So you took an interest in politics in general, or was it until then that you got actually involved in it, or were you quite diligent in the sort of minding the local politics and that kind of thing and discussing it?
No, hell no. No, I was not diligent at all. When I was 16, 17, 18, I had next to no interest in it. There were a couple of things that made a big difference. One was the election of the fourth Labour government in 1984. That's one of those watershed moments in New Zealand politics where you realise that everything's changed.
Yeah.
Some of that change was for the better, quite a lot of it was not, but the country was never the same again. And it was a really momentous event in the political consciousness of an awful lot of people, I think. For somebody who was 18 or 19 at the time, you're coming out of 9 years of Robert Muldoon's government for old men, and the country loosened the shackles socially, politically, economically. Some people paid a really high price for that, but there were other prices that were paid which were constructive and positive ones. So 1984 made a big difference. The other thing that made a really big difference to me was that I stumbled upon sociology. I didn't even know what it was before I came to university. And this university, Massey, did the thing for me that a good university should do for all students, which is it just kind of breaks the world open and you think, shit, I didn't know that, I didn't know that, I didn't know that, I didn't know that. My whole time here, particularly when I was doing sociology as part of the social work program, was one succession of I didn't know that after another. For 4 years I studied it and I loved it. And that was political in the sense that it talked about struggles for power and control and who has it and who hasn't got it, who's excluded, whose voices are heard, whose are not. So it wasn't New Zealand politics, but it was highly political content that was taught in the sociology program, and it really fundamentally changed the way that I engaged with the world. So that'd be the two things, sociology and 1984.
Cool. Specifically in terms of like politics with people like me, obviously, and it's very well known that I don't even know if you call it the youth. It almost seems to be the entirety of like the millennial generation and then younger don't care for it.
I have to bite my tongue. Have you finished yet?
Yeah.
That's bullshit. I think it's bullshit.
You reckon?
Yes, I do. I think I don't. It's not bullshit. That's not a very intelligent response. I think, Luke, that there is a story that is told, particularly by people who are closer to my age than yours, mid-50s, slightly entitled, grew up with enjoying the fruits of the post-war policy settlement, which saw the extension of state support in the form of free education, blah, 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 blah. So my generation, I'm the last of the baby boomers. I was born in 1964. We come through, we have this slightly overinflated sense about the extent to which we all involved ourselves with politics. And it's, it just isn't the case that there was ever a time in New Zealand when everybody was really keen about politics and they went to meetings and they were members of parties and they consumed the political news before they read the sport. Although, you listen to older people and you might well believe that there was such a time, but not anymore because all you young people are hanging out on your iMacs and your iPhones and one thing or another. And you're all disengaged and you're all lazy and apathetic. Some people are, but so are some old people. It's disinterest in politics is not age specific.
True.
It's something that's distributed across the population profile. I also I think when people say that, what they're doing is they're looking at voting figures.
True.
And they're saying, okay, voting turnout at elections is trucking south. Well, at least that was the case until 2014. A little bit of an upturn in 2014, a little bit of an upturn in 2017. Voting's heading south, and the highest incidence of non-participation in elections is amongst young people.
Yeah.
But that is a position that you can take. But then you have to ask, well, is it only young people who aren't voting? No, it's not only that. It's poor people. Voting amongst Māori people is lower than it tends to be amongst other ethnic groups. Voting amongst some new migrant communities, particularly ones who come from countries where they don't have strong democratic conventions and norms and traditions, that tends to be lower. People who feel marginalised are often the ones who don't vote. So there is the real question for me is, if younger people are less likely to vote, why is that? What is it that is going on? And I look at the world, and in particular, some of those policies that my generation and those above me have delivered to people of your generation, and think, shit, if I was a young person, I might be so pissed off about it that I wouldn't bother voting either. That wouldn't be my recommendation. I think how you change things by getting engaged, but I can see why. So it may be that there is less voter input, but it's not necessarily because you're lazy. It might be because you're disenfranchised, or you're disillusioned, or you're pissed off, or you just think there's no point because you keep voting and nothing changes. So the story that young people don't vote because they're lazy works in the interest of older people, but not in the interest of young people, and I don't buy it. I also think there's a lot of political activity that can't be captured if all you do is look at voting figures.
Yeah.
That's a bollocks way to conceptualize political activity. You have to look at the podcasts that people make, their engagement in various social media platforms, what they do with their spare time if they volunteer or they work for NGOs, or politics is done in all kinds of different ways, and only one of those ways is voting. And that only happens once every 3 years.
Yeah, true.
That's the other thing that irritates me with old people. They say, well, all we need to do is get out the turnout rate. And then what do you do for the next 3 years? Do nothing, disengage, think that it's all okay because you cast your vote. So I take your point. I think there is an issue around young people's engagement in formal politics, but it's a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than tends to be often acknowledged, I think.
Okay. That's cool. You know, I think you're definitely right about that, especially in terms of when your measurements are something like only just who's turning up for voting. It does make sense, especially because the world we live in is changing so rapidly technologically. So everybody does most of their political stuff in a technological fashion rather than because I mean, even for most of the people that I knew from it was last year at the election that I knew that voted or didn't. The ones that voted did it because there was a voting booth very close to them,
right.
And the ones that didn't because it's kind of they either just forgot or it wasn't really that much of a. It was too much of an inconvenience to go to it. Yeah. Can you think of any other way in which that we could do something like voting? Does it have to be that we go to a booth and vote?
No, it doesn't have to be.
Is it the kind of thing that you could change it so whether it's done online? You know how the census this year they tried to change it so it was a lot more digital. It kind of was a real big fuck up.
Yep. It kind of was.
You know, it didn't actually work that well.
No.
Is it something that could move in that way, or do you think we're always going to have voting booths and everybody has to go and line up and do the thing and get the sticker?
I don't think we will always do it that way. I think inevitably we will migrate online, but there are some good reasons for just being careful about that. The obvious one is Russia.
Yeah.
Right. Someone's going to hack your data. Someone's going to fuck around with your preferences. Someone's going to change your vote. So we have no confidence at this point that there are really secure, tight, well-managed platforms that will allow you to express your political preference online and for that information to be inviolate.
Yeah.
And that's a very legitimate concern, I think. The other issues, there is the census. I mean, I don't think we've heard this formally yet, but my understanding is that the valid response rate in the census process that we have just taken will be horribly low.
Yeah.
Possibly so low as to invalidate the data that were gathered.
Yeah.
Which is a really significant problem because we rely upon the census data, the time series data in particular, to make really significant policy commitments. And if the data aren't reliable or valid, then that's a huge problem. I have no idea what they do with that. So both in hardware and software terms, we're a little way off coming up with something that is inviolate. Blockchain technology might, if it's suitably adapted, serve a really useful purpose in that respect, but what that would necessarily do is take the state right out of the equation, and I'm not sure the state would want that. But I find it really difficult to imagine that in 30 years' time we'll be chugging off to the town hall or the local school hall to cast a vote. I don't think that will happen. Equally, I'm not convinced that to the extent that it's a problem, low-ish voter turnout and really low voter turnout amongst some groups is going to be solved through a tech solution. That'll be a part of it, certainly. But if you're not that interested or you're not that engaged or you feel alienated or you feel really pissed off or you choose not to vote and it's a principled position, I actively choose not to vote because I don't want to support the system or I don't agree with them or whatever, then having a technological solution available at your fingertips is not going to solve that problem.
True.
So the problem is not then voter turnout. The problem is something else that's leading to the reduction in voter turnout.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for that. What else do I have for you? Oh, what do you think of just the general political climate in New Zealand at the moment?
I have to say that I'm one of those people who is hanging out for the name of the Prime Minister's baby. I think my partner and I talked a lot about that. Partly it's because we're of an age where we'd quite like grandchildren of our own, so this is a surrogate grandchild for thousands of older people. I think this kind of does give away my political preferences. I'm not unhappy with the way the 2007 government formation process eventually resolved itself. I don't really subscribe to the narrative that says this is a three-headed hydra that is out of control and it can't run itself and the government is in a state of chaos and so on. I'm really interested in the way that these three parties are having to make it work. I'm much more interested in the fact that they have a genuinely transformative political agenda. Yeah. I've lived, what are the big periods? pre-1984 Muldoon years, that they were just awful. 84 to 90 was a big political period of upheaval, some of it constructive, some of it not. The decades of national governments of the 90s with budget austerity were not ones that I think any of us would want to live through again. Helen Clark's administrations in the early part of the century pulled things back towards the centre and the centre-left a little. The key administrations, I can't even remember what they were for now, apart from tax cuts and a flag referendum. They left no lasting imprint upon the landscape apart from demoralisation amongst the public services, a rundown, a kind of depreciation in the infrastructure of our health system, increasingly out of control house prices, and rising child poverty.
Yeah.
This administration, whether it succeeds or fails, at least has said, this is not us. We are not these people. We are better than this. We can look after our homeless people. We can look after our children. We can ensure that our young people can move into houses that are slightly more affordable. They've got a hell of a lot of work to do. It won't happen in 6 years, let alone 3.
Yeah.
But we needed to have somebody who said, we've had enough. There have been 30 years worth of political economic reforms which have been predicated upon the idea that people are fundamentally selfish.
Yeah.
And that you should look after yourself. And that if you can't, well, that's your problem. That's not a political philosophy that I think produces particularly healthy outcomes for lots of people, and possibly for most people. Some of us benefit. I benefit. All those tax cuts that have accrued over the last 20 years or so, I've benefited from every single one of them. But my children don't necessarily. I don't know if you do. You and your partner probably don't. Lots of people don't.
Yeah.
And I have not enjoyed seeing the erosion over a long period of time of the sense of the ties that bind us. We keep telling ourselves these stories as New Zealanders about what a decent people we are, or what decent people we are, and how fair-minded we are, and so on and so forth. But in fact, we're often not.
Yeah.
We're often vicious, and we're nasty, and we're malevolent, and we make people suffer for what we think are problems that they have brought about for themselves. Just try harder, just do a little bit more, work a little bit harder. We individualise all this stuff. To some extent that's the case, but I'm really heartened by the change in the language that this Prime Minister uses in particular. Every second word that comes out of her mouth is something like kind or generous. And those are nebulous things, but they're incredibly important. And I think that was really, really, really stark. There was a meme doing the rounds the day that her child was born, which had Donald Trump and a mashup of Donald Trump and a child on the Mexican border.
Yeah.
This is them and this is us. And there was that photo that she and Gabe had tweeted out with her and the baby and her partner.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a crude juxtaposition, but I'd much rather be one of those things than the other.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the political climate now is more conducive to us becoming the kind of nation that we like to think we are, rather than the one that we've slowly become over the last 30 years or so.
Definitely. There definitely seems to be a lot more of a discourse now, and for people like me and sort of who don't travel in the circles of like where actual proper talking about what's happening in the country actually happens, where most of our information is got from stuff or Facebook posts or things like that. It wasn't until, was it Taika? Called out New Zealand for being racist.
Racist as fuck.
Yes, which started this conversation. And now, I mean, he obviously highlighted just that one part of it. And there's an assortment of all these other problems. But it sort of made everyone go, there might actually be a problem. Yeah. Rather than just sort of say, no, we're great. New Zealand, Aotearoa is fantastic. Full stop. I suppose there was the two responses. He's a representative of New Zealand, he shouldn't be saying that, and he's a representative of New Zealand, he should be saying that.
Yeah. And I think if we really are the kind of place we tell ourselves we are, we should be able to have that conversation and not get as extraordinarily defensive about it as we witness in some of the blowback that he got. There were pieces that I remember that Duncan Garner wrote, Damien Grant, a few of the other sort of centre-right commentators, actually quite a few of them, just seemed to lose their rags entirely. They seemed unable to accept that maybe he had a point. Get past his language, but maybe he had a point. We used to, for the better part of the 20th century, there was this trope that we promoted about ourselves, which had it that we were a country with great race relations. And what we saw in response to Taika's post was basically that narrative being rehearsed again for the 21st century. And it's freaking ridiculous because you need nothing more than a passing knowledge of the land wars and parihaka and the treatment of young Māori kids in state care. And, you don't need to know very much to realise that we have got issues. And unless you're the kind of person who's prepared to say, that's your problem because you're a Māori person and there's something about you that causes this disproportionate harm, then you have to accept that we collectively have some kind of an issue.
Yeah.
And he just, Taika he just named it.
Yeah.
And the responses were fascinating one way or another. There was something in the Sunday Star Times in the little supplement. You wouldn't read these things, Luke, because it's paper.
No.
But if you had happened to have read it over the weekend, there was a woman who was commenting. She's an op-ed writer. I can't remember her name. She's good. She had said something about the use of Māori language, increasing use of Māori language in public radio in particular.
Okay.
So Morning Report, Susie Ferguson, Guy Espiner, who's married to a really extraordinarily good young Māori woman writer called Emma Espiner, writes bits for the Spin-Off and for the newsroom and so on. He uses quite a bit of Māori, but it's like 0.01% of the total language spoken on the show. It's just at the beginning and at the end. And she had this woman in the Sunday Star Times had opined on that and got some letter from Dale. And Dale, we're not sure whether it's a male or a female Dale, had some stunningly virulent things to say about the Māori language. And so we do have a problem.
Yeah.
And I doubt that Dale is the only person who holds those views. But we have to be able to have that conversation without shooting people or shouting at them or physically or verbally assaulting them. We really don't want to wind up in a situation like they have in the United States where you can't have the conversation.
Yes.
Because there is no common ground at all. There's no conversation to be had. There is just kind of hurling insults at each other.
Yeah. Interestingly, I wanted to touch on that in particular because New Zealand politics is one thing, but American politics is so much more interesting. Yeah. It's like the best reality TV show ever. And especially with because I spend a lot of time sort of listening to most of the media I consume, whether they be podcasts or YouTube channels, they're coming from America. And because of the way that I am, and probably just by virtue of being a young person who's also at university, everything's very left-leaning. Do you find that or do you think perhaps that the yelling and the screaming at each other, which seems that's all that's happening at the moment, I feel like it's slowly starting to change. They are finally starting to have proper discourses about things. Is that generally coming from the sort of far left or the far right?
I come at that from a couple of directions. I think in the United States, if you look at a broad sample of news websites from the United States, then I'm not sure that I would see terribly many signs of there being any kind of a conversation. You have Fox, Sean Hannity, Breitbart. We hear a bit less of these days because Banner's no longer in the White House. But you have a kind of an unreconstructed alternative right blogosphere, webosphere, and its editorial line is pretty consistent, and you know what you're going to get. And it's for somebody like me who's not politically of that inclination, it's really salutary and concerning and not pleasant to spend time bouncing around some of those websites. But from time to time I'll do it. I don't do it for very long, and I don't enjoy it. And I feel like I have to come out and wash myself afterwards because the degree of vituperativeness around women, black people, Jews, kind of anybody really who isn't some imaginary white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male or female from the Midwest is just so incredibly toxic that it's just discomforting. We don't, whale oil doesn't even come close to that. That's probably the most objectionable from my point of view site that you can visit in New Zealand, but it doesn't come remotely close to hitting the threshold that some of those American right-wing sites do. the mainstream press in the States, I mean, you can find reasoned and reasonable mainstream press in the left and the right. I don't tend to read the far left material. I don't find that necessarily that constructive either. I don't know that I see terribly many examples of those two voices finding a common terrain in the United States. In fact, if anything, with the midterm congressional elections approaching in November of this year, that stuff is really ramping up.
Yeah.
The volume's just kind of up past 10 now. In New Zealand, it's a little bit different. Quite a lot of the mainstream media, in my view, the editorial line of the mainstream media, whether you read the print versions or the online versions, is pretty centre-right. It's hard to look at the New Zealand Herald and read John Hawkesby and Kate Hawkesby and Mike Hoskins and Kate Hawkesby and so on. And Audrey Young, I think, it's increasingly a voice for reason within there, but a number of those other opinion writers and journos that they truck out on the Herald's website, they're pretty clearly nailed their colours to the editorial master, the centre-right, and they're frequently complaining about the domination of the left voice in New Zealand political commentary. But man, I don't know where it is. Radio New Zealand is a public service website. I think that it's done a really outstanding job of demonstrating that it's non-partisan. When Claire Curran was getting herself into all sorts of trouble with Carol Hirschfield, the Radio New Zealand was outing their own minister. They did a really superb job of holding her to account. So that I don't think you can look at RNZ and say, well, it's a hotbed of centre-left or socialist journalism. That's not a position you can sensibly take. Two new, relatively new, not that new additions to the media sphere, which I think are really, really healthy developments. One of those is Newsroom, and the other one's a spin-off. And I really like their business models. They're relatively non-aligned. They're for-profit clearly, but they take a really independent editorial line. They've got good long-form journalism. It's not too long.
Yeah,
you don't get entirely bored with it, but there's enough meat in there. They just take time to deal with issues well, and so what you have is informed investigative journalism rather than Kate Hawkesby volunteering her opinion on X, and I'm not quite sure what qualifies her to offer that, as if we would pay it, any more attention than you'd pay mine or me yours.
Yeah.
It's just an opinion, and frankly, most people's opinions are not ones that I'm that interested in or find worth reading. I want to learn something, so I want an opinion from somebody who's in the field, who has knowledge, who has discretion, who has judgment, who has some wisdom they can bring to bear, rather than somebody who's just going to turn the emotional reactor up to 10 and blurt something out. So there's some kind of interesting developments. I think in New Zealand we don't have that partisanship. We don't have that degree of incredible toxicity between positions on the left and on the right. I don't see any evidence of that developing here, although from time to time on specific issues, and you would think Māori issues in particular, anything to do with the Treaty of Waitangi, mention of the land wars. That's where you see it. That's where you see it start to, you get the ugly side of things start to emerge, and then it disappears again. It'll come back again until we've resolved those things. But a hell of a lot of, you listen to radio, you watch the TV, you listen to the Prime Minister, baby's got a Te Araha middle name. Māori words are appearing increasingly just in it's just normal. It's just what we do increasingly. And if you're Don Brash or Don Esselmont, you're really discomforted by that. But welcome to the 21st century. It's the way we are these days. Exactly. And if you're an old white guy and you can't cope with that, then there's nowhere for you to go. Yeah. Your time or your political time has gone. We've moved through that now, and we're in a different phase, and there's plenty to work out and lots of bloody gnarly conversations to be had. But I don't think that I would be the only middle-aged white person who said I'm. It brings me hope to look at this world that my daughters, who are your age, a little bit younger, are growing up in is going to be a better world, both domestically and I think eventually internationally, than the one that I grew up in. So that's good. Cool. As quite a swing from the left field here, I want to talk to you a bit more about sort of BAs in general, because a lot of your work and a lot of what I've read of you outside of Massey has been, I don't know if justifying is the right word, but sort of exposing the benefits of a BA, a Bachelor of Arts, over something, or maybe not over, but to keep them comparably on the same level as something like a Bachelor of Commerce or a Bachelor of Science. Because I didn't actually, and I think a lot of people
I actually think a lot of people see the jokes that are made about people who get arts degrees and don't actually associate that with Bachelors of Arts until they are, for some reason, involved in a university. And then they're like, oh, that's what an arts degree is. not the person that went and did a Bachelor of something in fine art and,
Sculpting.
Yes, that kind of thing. That's what I always put it down to. But it wasn't until I got here and I realized, and I thought, shit, that's what I'm doing.
Your degree.
Yeah, that can't be right. So why, and I'm sure you've written about it hundreds of times, but what are your main talking points when someone goes, well, it's useless, you should be doing something else? What is your main go-to to prove them wrong?
Oh, my main go-to, the thing I'd really like to do is just slap them. But I can't do that. My main go-to is a 2013 statistic from the Ministry of Education, which looked at employment outcomes for Bachelor of Arts graduates and Bachelor of Science or BSc graduates 9 years post-employment. The likelihood of a BSc graduate having degree-related job 9 years post-graduation was 72%. The equivalent figure for an arts graduate was 74%. There was around about $4,000 net difference between the salaries, the median salaries of BA and BSc grads. BSc grads pull around about 64,000 9 years post-qualification. BA grads 60,000. So we earn a little bit less. Our student loan is probably lower. But it's not a hell of a lot. And when you strip tax out of that, the effective difference between a BSc and a BA washes away.
Yeah.
But our students, it's empirical, it's evidence, it's from the frickin' government, and it says that our students' employment outcomes are marginally better than those for students in the STEM disciplines. So that would be the main take-home. And there's a bunch of new data which comes out that I haven't crunched yet, but I'm going to update those figures. 2013 is a wee while ago now. There is the other conversation that I will have with anybody who stands still long enough to have it is about the fourth industrial revolution and the impact of automation and robotification and digitization of work upon work. It is fundamentally impossible to Google terms like fourth industrial revolution, future of work, and come up with a list of highly employable skills that does not look like the graduate profile of a BA student. You cannot do it. Google, several years ago, ran a project, and the name of it has unhelpfully temporarily escaped me. Shit. And I wrote about this the other day. They went back through gazillions of years worth of employment data of Google employees, and what they tried to do was to identify the skill sets of the most valuable employees. Project Oxygen, maybe, is that what it was called? And much to everybody's surprise, they found that tech-related skills were the least best indicators of the best employees at Google. A really good Google employee is one who has a whole series of what are either called transferable or soft or portable skills, which are the kinds of things that we teach in a Bachelor of Arts. Capacity to get on with people, do group work, work collectively, be quiet, listen to somebody else, create a reasoned and reasonable argument, cope with cultural difference. All that stuff that doesn't look like a job winds up being exactly what you need in a rapidly changing world of work in which anything that can be automated will be.
Yeah.
And in that which can't be automated, the stuff that requires you to exercise discretion and judgment and to exercise those faculties that make you fundamentally human, which are all of the things that are layered through a well-structured arts curriculum, they're the things that are going to find you work.
Yeah.
So and I say this often, and I'm not entirely taking the piss, but it seems to me, and an awful lot of people who are better placed to comment on this than me, whose work I cite, that a BA, if it's well structured and it's well taught and it's well assessed and it's well supported, is pretty much the perfect degree for the 21st century. So we've got the figures that indicate that that's the case, and we know just by scanning the future that our graduates are going to be well placed. There are a couple of go-to quotes that I go from, one from the Chief Executive Officer of the Employers Manufacturers Association in Auckland, a guy called Kim Campbell, who in an RNZ interview in May of 2016 said, boy, soft skills, they're what you need to build a career. We can teach you the tech stuff, we can teach you the mechanical stuff, we cannot teach you how to think. If you come to us fully formed as a critical thinker, then we'll go for you, because we can teach you how to do the job. The other one was a guy called Mark Averill, who's the CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's got this fantastic quote, which is on a high rotate in my presentations, which says, we appoint people to IT positions or positions in IT industries, and increasingly we're going after arts graduates for those jobs, because they know how to hold and build and nurture social relationships, and we can teach them the tech stuff. So this old New Zealand story about a BA being bugger all and about as useful as a park bench for supporting your family, you know all those tropes. They're 30 years out of date. They're empirically wrong, and they're also ignorant. What they tend to do, I think, is equate jobs with degrees. So you look at the name of a degree and you think, oh, that looks like a job. So Bachelor of Business or Commerce or Vet or Science, that kind of looks like a job. Bachelor of Arts, oh, fuck, no one makes money out of arts anymore. Some people do, but not that many. So there's a fundamental problem, which is you have to, these days, in the kind of context that I work in and you study in, you have to read what's occurring in the labour force, track backwards and think, right, what is the labour force of the future going to need? And we know, because employers tell us. We've done survey work and we read the literature. They tell us what we need are people who can think, to kind of crunch it all down. But the public debate around this is still lagging well behind. So part of my job is to go out as often and as broadly as I can and say, look, just this is the go. Stop slagging us off. It doesn't mean that you have to do our degree. Go and be a vet or a science person or a business person if you want to. But change the language around the Bachelor of Arts, because we know that our economy is going to need to have people who have our skills, people who look like you, not your mate who does a science degree. She'll get a job too, but increasingly the work that she does is going to be automated. Yeah, it's a little more difficult to automate the jobs in which there is the exercise of discretion and judgment and wisdom and so on. So that's a long-winded, rambly way of saying you don't have to do an arts degree, but don't tell anybody who is doing an arts degree that it's not going to pay off in terms of employment, because you're wrong. Yeah. But the data, the evidence, and it isn't mine, it's other people's. The evidence says that it will. Doesn't mean that everybody who gets an arts degree is going to get 60K. First job off the ranks, because we can't control for all sorts of things. But the degree itself is increasingly important, I think. But there is another reason as well. And there is a risk, I think, in talking purely about employment outcomes. Man, you look around the world, we've been talking about issues in this country and issues in the United States and the rise of populism in Eastern Europe and the Italian elections and various other signs of a world that is not at ease with itself. And this is a really good time, I think, to be doing a qualification like an arts degree, which teaches you how to think and how to evaluate evidence and how to sift the merits of competing claims to truth, how to ask really piercing, good questions. Yeah. How to learn the language that enables you to look at people in positions of economic or political and cultural power and hold them to account, how to question received wisdoms, how to challenge sacred cows, how not to take anything for granted. Yeah. This is a really important time in history, I think, to have people who can do those kinds of things as well.
I found, just with my own experiences of coming to university, talking to pretty much anyone that's older than me, the question is, what's the job after that? Do you think we still have, and this could be wrapped up in the weird, like you said, New Zealand in certain aspects are lagging behind. Now, I'm not talking specifically about BAs, but there seems to be a lot of, I don't know if you'd say apathy, but hesitation or devaluing of what university can do in general. Yep. You're better off just getting a trade. You're better off just going to work, just doing this.
Yeah. You're right. There is, and it's and I don't think it's very helpful for some people. University is absolutely not the place to be, and I feel quite strongly that schools ought not. I don't know if they do, but I don't believe it's helpful to have a default assumption, which is you should go to university. Most people in New Zealand don't. Something less than 25% of the entire population has an undergraduate degree, and by the time you get up the food chain to PhDs, then it's vanishingly small.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of a sense that everybody has a bachelor's degree of some sort, and they don't. That's not factually the case. We do. What do we know? We think we know that around about 2/3 of all secondary school children in year 13 this year will do work that doesn't yet exist. We're pretty sure that a whole heap of that work is going to involve the life of the mind. So going to a tertiary institution, whether it's a university or a polytech or a Wānanga or whatever, is probably not a bad idea. But we also know that we need people who can build houses and bridges and roads and who can perform magical things with cars and various other things. So we're always going to require trades as well.
Yeah.
So it is unhelpful, and you're right. We often, in this country, default to a binary. You either do this or you do that, or the system should be responsive to this or responsive to that. What we need are public policies that are supportive of both of those kinds, both education and training. We tend to focus on the provision of an education in university. My mates who work at the Polytech in town focus on the provision of a training, and we really need both of those things. Everybody's always got a story about their neighbour's mate's niece who went off and got a trade and made $1 gazillion by the time she was 23. Often that's just bullshit. People make that stuff up. But there are people who've done that, but not everybody who chose that route has done that.
Yeah.
For some people it works and for some it does. And often for 18, 19-year-olds, work is not foremost in their minds. That class that you were in with me last year, rough, completely making it up, pull a figure out of the air, I would say, but more than a half of those people in that class are not at university because they want to get a job. They're here because they're a little bit unsure about what they want to do. They're buying some time, or they're here because they're really freaking interested in medieval French history.
Yeah.
And they just want to take some time to learn a whole heap about that, as well as a range of other things. They want to exercise their minds and develop that part of the kind of human condition. And in the process of doing that, they wind up learning a whole bunch of skills, intangible, soft or transferable skills, which will help them when they find work. The content of the degree may or may not be relevant, might be irrelevant, but what they've learned is a function of being here and having to work to timetables and construct compelling ideas and do research and communicate the fruits of the research and so on, are all things that you just pick up and you drop them into any job.
Yeah.
So that's where we add value, I think. It's not so much the content. But I agree with your fundamental point, which is in New Zealand we tend to be, there's a strong strand of anti-intellectualism because we look at what you might be doing here or what I might be doing here and we can't see anything. There's no widget. There's no material thing that comes out of it. So it doesn't look like real work.
Yeah.
It's kind of pretend work, as if real work has to be manual, it has to involve the hands, it has to produce physical artifacts. That's real work. Anything that involves the life of the mind, that's somehow not real work, that's something else. And we do tend still to undervalue it. We're probably not alone in that, but we're quite good at that in New Zealand. I don't think it's particularly helpful in the context of a future that is looming. It's not even looming, it's here, it's arrived, in which a lot of that manual work will simply cease to exist. Yeah. Have you ever been to a bank teller?
Once.
Right, once.
Once, maybe twice.
Yeah, and when was the last time any of us ever went to an actual person at Pack and Save? We use the self-checkout lanes as a rule. So you can, even a short space of time, you can see work going. Tradies' work won't necessarily go, but it doesn't take much imagination to figure out that at some point, and probably in the not terribly distant future, constructing and putting together a house will be modularized to the extent that an awful lot of it could be done by some robotic kind of thing. That's something that can be automated, you would think. And that'll apply to all sorts of other jobs, not just manual labour, either, plenty of professions.
Definitely.
Law, accountancy, teaching perhaps. I can see a case for my job disappearing in 5, 10, 15 years. You design a system that's a machine learning algorithm that's clever enough to hoover up information and learn, plug all the books and articles I've got in my office into it, on my desktop and hard drive, and it'll do a better job than I will do because it won't be tired, won't get grumpy, it'll be completely dispassionate, it'll be non-partisan when it needs to be. it won't be a particularly pleasant experience as a student, I wouldn't have thought. But you can see a case for replacing people like me with smart tech as well. So it's not just the manual labourers for whom the robots are coming, I think.
Of course. Actually, it's sort of on that same sort of note. One of the biggest takeaways I had coming to university, and I think it was a bit of a shock, and I don't know if I'd call it a disappointment, but I assumed that once I got here, it's like these doors would open and this plethora of world knowledge would pour upon me, and I would be like, wow, all of this stuff exists. Yeah. But I got here and realized that this is all there. It's everywhere. These books is like specifically my political philosophy that I did, and we read Plato, and we read Mill, and we read Marx, and all of the staples of like Western political thinking. I already read half of them, and I was planning to read a lot of them. But what I think, and then stop me if you think I'm wrong, what I think a big part of what university does is it takes someone who's read all of it or looked at a lot of it and puts a frame around it.
Yep.
And says, this is how you, because like something like Plato is just hard to read, So you don't start with Plato. You start with something that's a bit more digestible. You don't start with Nietzsche. You start with like, something that's written easily, that has themes that sort of go along with other certain types of writers. And then you go along that route. But that's really hard to figure out unless someone who's already gone, put in the time, read all of these things, has created a framework for you to consume the information. I mean, apart from probably the plethora of academic articles through the library, everything else you can get free or super cheap.
You can. In fact, there's not even the stuff that's locked up inside the big packages that the library purchases from the publishing companies, Taylor and Francis and Elsevier and so on. A lot of that stuff has found its way out into the world as well. You can get it through people's LinkedIn pages or through ResearchGate or through Google Scholar. Some of it you can't, but increasingly you can. So it is all out there. But the fact that the information is freely available doesn't neatly translate into its consumption. No one's going to sit down at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon and read Nietzsche or read some of the political science that I write because it would seem like a cool thing to do. That doesn't happen. And even if you did, unless you have some of those sense-making categories already in situ inside of your mind, they're not going to make sense. You'll consume a discrete standalone artifact, and then you'll consume another one, and then another one, and then another one. But unless you have sense-making categories which come out of your discipline, you won't be able to draw the connections between. So rather than having 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 5, you'll just have 1 plus 1 plus 1, and you won't necessarily gain the aggregate benefit from throwing all of those things at each other in some kind of fruitful collision and making sense of what comes out of it. So you're right, you do, and this is where the robots may not be all that helpful. You do need somebody who has been through that process, particularly if they've been through the undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD route, so they've been taught to think in a more or less disciplined way, and they can help you make those connections. That's what good teachers do. We've all been in front of teachers who are really piss poor at their job and who don't do that, who can't enable that. But the great teachers are the ones who can tell the story in a really compelling way and can take us with them as they make those connections. And they use their disciplinary lenses. So they use the ways of explaining the world that a discipline like philosophy or psychology or political science or English lit or whatever have to offer. And you use those to illuminate all of that information, all of that knowledge that is out there. And that's how you turn data into information and then into knowledge. Without some sense of how to attribute meaning or how to understand a thing, then what you are faced with, it's like the kind of the matrix. It's just line after line of code. And it doesn't make any sense. It's just data. In order to tie pieces of data together to tell a story, you need to have some kind of a disciplined sense-making lens, and that's what a university does. It's a hell of a lot easier to do it in a classroom than it is to do it offline. I know you're doing some distance learning at the moment, and I think that's probably the most challenging way of doing it. But the case for having a classroom, and in particular a small discursive tutorial, is that you can draw on the sense-making abilities of all of the people who are in that room, and it's the job of the tutor to guide the conversation in some kind of more or less structured way. You can't do that by scanning Google Scholar and downloading shitload of stuff and then just reading it for fun. You will certainly get something out of that, but there has to be some sort of curriculum around it. And particularly there's got to be well-designed assessment that steps you through that learning and ensures that you have achieved whatever was specified as the learning outcomes in advance.
Definitely. Cool. It seems to be that a lot of the key parts of understanding, and there might be because, like I said, I do mostly philosophy and psychology, and a lot of it seems to come down to discussions.
Yep.
That's where, I mean, I can read all sorts, but it's the talking about it. Yep. I guess also discussions and conversations you have is kind of like another form of thinking.
Yeah,
You're just sort of thinking on the fly, similar to like what writing. And I think that's what journaling does for a lot of people, is just by talking to someone is sort of the next best thing. So I suppose, especially with things that are a bit more esoteric, like philosophy and that kind of thing, it is the discussion that's required. So yeah, it's a good point in that you will need at least a classroom, because I mean, you can talk online with people, but it doesn't take long before that devolves into nothing, you know.
Then you talk online to people, but people in general terms find it quite hard to distinguish context. If you're talking online with somebody in the context of a university course, that's not a social media moment. So the norms and conventions of behaviour are quite different. But increasingly what I see and my colleagues see is people whose interactions with others are very substantially shaped by social media world, bringing those forms of behaviour into online forums and universities, and it's fucking hopeless. It doesn't work. You can't have a conversation. So the art and craft of learning how to converse involves, as much as anything else, learning how to hold your peace, to be quiet and to listen to what somebody else has to say, and then to respond appropriately to that. So that the art and craft of a conversation, which is one of the fundamental things that employers will tell me that they're looking for, is incredibly hard to learn.
Yeah.
It isn't that it's fallen into disrepair, but it is one of the things that I think is it's one of the great things about coming to a university. If you wind up in a tutorial or a lecture theatre where you have those conversations, there is an awful lot that you learn.
Yeah.
And much of the learning is not about what is said. It's that tacit stuff that sits just beneath the waterline. It has to do with how things are said and how you listen and how you respond and how you deal with a different point of view, or somebody who you think you would dislike intensely if you ever had anything to do with them outside of this class, but you have to get on with them because they're in this class.
Yeah.
It's all that stuff, all that kind of soft stuff, which is it's really difficult to do. It doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's part of the art and craft of being a good student. And it shouldn't end either. That is the kind of thing that continues forever.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, I think that's pretty much it. That's all I wanted to talk to. That's all I wanted to talk to you about. Do you have sort of anything coming up that if people wanted to find anything else about you or read anything that you've done on sort of like a consumer grade level, what would they look for?
They would just Google my name, Massey University, Bachelor of Arts, or BA.
Cool.
There's plenty of stuff out there that I've written for the popular press that has to do with the positive case for doing a BA. And when I do that stuff, the people I have in mind are people like you. So my people, the people who do my courses, and that's my program. I'm not having a pot shot at anybody who chooses to do vet or go off and become a mechanic or whatever. Those are all important functions and occupations and vocations, and we need those things. Yeah. But my people are the people who come to do philosophy or politics or history or classics or literature or whatever the case may be. And what I'm concerned to do is to craft and repeat on high rotate a story about the reasons for doing a Bachelor of Arts, which are empirically based and which are much more positive than the traditional narrative tends to be. Cool. So Googling my name, BA, see how you go. Fantastic. Right. Well, thank you so much, Richard. This has been fantastic. Everybody else that's listening, hopefully this has all worked out and the videos work perfectly and the audio's going great and it's not all weird and janky. But thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode of Minds of Giants. Cool.